Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Planet in Focus Ecofilm Lab program. This module will be all about wildlife filmmaking and documentary cinematography. So for today's session, we are so lucky to have Jack Weisman with us. Jack is a filmmaker, a cinematographer, and he's the co-director of the Oscar and now Emmy-nominated Nuisance Bear. So thank you so much, Jack, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Jack, just a friendly reminder, the Ecofilm Lab is for elementary and high school students to tell their own environmental stories. So, diving right into it, what inspired you to get into documentary filmmaking?
Oh, that's a good question that I don't know if I have a short answer for, but I think documentary found me in a lot of ways. I grew up like, with a group of friends who were really adventurous, and we needed to document our antics to prove that we had jumped off this cliff or asked this girl out or something like that. And so it just was a natural development for me from a kind of a young age. I'd say about even 12 or 13, we started playing with cameras. And I didn't know that I loved it at the time. I mean, I obviously was doing it all the time, recording stuff with my friends and making videos with, a Final Cut that we had pirated on somebody's parents' computer in their basement, and just, figuring out the process for ourselves. Um, and then I got to the end of high school. My grades were like, okay, I guess. And I didn't get into some of the better schools that I had hoped to, but I did get into a film program in Toronto. And my parents, who are both artists, and as the son of artists, of course, I had to be rebellious and reject art altogether. I was like, I'm not going to be an artist. I'm going to go into business or law or something like that. But then, it came time to make a decision to go to school somewhere. And my parents like, you should go to this film program. This sounds really amazing. You love filmmaking. And so I ended up at York. And again, sort of, they gave us a bunch of options. You can sort of study narrative filmmaking or documentary, or experimental. And I don't know, I guess I just gravitated towards documentary, and lucky that I had that connection from a young age, and has sort of just kept following that passion.
You definitely found you, and you found your style in it too. It's so incredible
Thanks.
the work that you do. So when it comes to finding a story, how did you come up with the idea of Nuisance Bear?
That's a great question. Well, in some ways it was kind of a eureka, like, oh, we have to make a film about this. And in other ways it was like a really long, 8 year of figuring out how to best approach
Years.
the
Wow.
film. Yeah. So I went up to Churchill, the town where this film takes place, Churchill, Manitoba, when my partner Gabriella, and we were still students in university, and we were working on like a student project. And we got thrown into this environment not really knowing what it was going to be like. We'd seen polar bears on television, and I'm actually guilty. I'm an American, and I'm a Canadian permanent resident now. And
Oh,
so I didn't even know there were polar bears in Canada at the time. um, so anyways, I got thrown into this trip at the very last minute. We went up there. It was this crazy circus, so different from what I had expected. And we were just struck by a need to make a film about what was happening outside of those frames, of those wildlife photography pictures and television shows. Um, and we had this idea. We got some amazing stuff, but it was still like, it was very chaotic. We were quite inexperienced, and we were only there for 5 days because it's so expensive to be there. It was like $10,000 just to be there for 5 days, because we didn't know anybody, and so we were paying maximum prices on all that stuff too. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, it just sort of lit a fire, I guess, because I just knew really strongly that someone had to make a film about this place and these animals and their interdependence and relationship. But I didn't know, and we didn't know until many years later, how we would shoot Nuisance Bear. The equipment only really became available recently to do the types of long lens gimbal moving shots that Planet Earth and other high budget, Disney wildlife shows can do for folks like ourselves, independent filmmakers. And so, COVID happened. We didn't have much to do. Manitoba didn't go into lockdown, and we happened to sort of like slip through all of the lockdowns within, according to all of the regulations at the time, and we were able to film in Churchill during COVID. So we didn't have any interaction really with people in the town at that time. I mean, we have lots of friends there, but we had to be cautious, and so shooting the film from inside of a car and just driving around for a month was a really COVID safe thing to do, we felt. And we were unemployed, so we were all taking CERB and not being paid, and just the moment lined up for us to make this film, and it sort of came together in the edit in a lot of ways. We've been trying to make this longer feature film. Basically, we didn't know we were going to make a short, and then it turned into a short because I had been talking to some mentors, and they were like, this is a really great concept, but I think you need to like demonstrate it, as a short film, so you
Start
can
small, like baby
start
steps.
small. Yeah, start small. And I took that advice, and yeah. Anyways, the film was very much made in the edit. So when we were making the film, I mean, people disagree with it. Like, you knew what you were doing, but when we were making the film, we were shooting in Churchill. None of us would have ever expected the result would have been what it has been. Like, we didn't
Right.
even know we were making this short film at the time. And, we might have had a glimpse of that when that bear crosses the road, like that opening shot. When we captured that, like, we all gasped. And I think we knew in that moment, like, this was something really profound. But yeah, it was kind of an amazing experience because it was so free, there wasn't any pressure.
Well, that reminds me of one of the questions I wanted to ask, because obviously filming wildlife is different than a traditional film or documentary where, the script is different. And when it comes to wildlife, you can't, things don't go to plan. So how
No.
did you know a little bit in advance of where you wanted the beginning, the middle, and the end of your story to go? Or did you just go with the flow the whole time and you changed the story as you went?
Totally jazz. We didn't have a shot list. We didn't have a plan. We were sleeping in. We were quite inefficient because we didn't know we were making this. We had a lot of time there. We gave ourselves about 40 days to shoot. And when you're driving around making a film, it's so different than every other film I've ever made. You're able to conserve a lot of energy because you're just sitting there a lot of times, just heated, comfortable, having snacks, doing impressions for the bears, just having a good time. So anyways, I lost my train of thought there. What was the question again?
It was about sticking to the story or having a script, right? We're
Right. Okay.
scaling this down slightly for young students. Going with the flow is a great rule. Knowing or creating a story from what you know. Maybe it's a place you visited as a kid, or you
Mm,
drove by with your parents that,
hmm.
that triggered some imagination, and you want to tell a story about that area or that park or that butterfly that you saw. Let's scale it down a little bit, so then when it comes to telling your story and having a plan,
Mm.
a what was the original beginning, middle, and end, and how do you pivot and change it when things don't always go to plan?
Right, right. Yeah, we really didn't have a beginning, middle, and end before the film. Like, while we were shooting it, I think when the bear crossed the road, we realized that might be an incredible beginning, because the
Yeah.
bear sort of transitions out of the wilderness, and then it gets, uh, you know, the tourists are just there. And so in the films that I make, a lot of times the magic happens well in the field, like moments like that, but a lot of times it's in the edit. You come back and you only have a certain number of puzzle pieces to put together, and so you just have to make a story with what you've got. And so it was a very intuitive process editing the film too. I'm a pretty
Mhm.
intuitive person. I feel like I follow my intuition. And when I was editing that first assembly, which basically was more or less the structure for what the final film was too, right after we got back from Churchill, we started the assembly started with the bear crossing the road, and then it ended with the airlift. It just felt like a natural, sort of
Right.
heartbreaking and absurd ending, a bear being lifted into the sky. So that kind of became the two moments that we like knew were part of the story structure, and then sort of just the cat and mouse of the helicopters and the conservation officers and the trucks and the bears is, another. That's basically what the film is. I mean, it's a bear trying go to a dump and getting chased away a bunch of times. And so that dynamic became really interesting. And once we had this, you start editing often with just, or for every person it's different, but I do a lot of editing on my own work. And for me, it's very much like a visual process first, like trying to build a visual story. And then I started to add the sound design, and the sound design and the sound effects really made the whole project come alive in a different way, because we didn't record any sound while we were making this film. It
Absolutely.
wasn't possible.
Yeah.
And so once we added the sound and we had sort of a basic structure of like the bear crossing the road, gets chased around a lot, and then gets caught and airlifted, it became about like sort of refining that story. But that's basically the arc for the film. And that came together, yeah, again, sort of while we were editing the film more than while we were shooting it.
That's a great note, and I've heard this before of sometimes you find a beginning and you find the end, and then you kind of put all the meat together in the middle of the sandwich, and uh,
Yeah.
that's kind of a strategy I've heard many times. And when you're dealing with animals, they can't talk, you can't interview them,
Yeah.
you got to kind of figure it out as you go. So that's a really
Yeah.
great point for wildlife filmmaking, is maybe you find these magic moments and you decide, is that the beginning, is that going to be the end, or maybe that's the climax in the middle of the film. So
Yeah.
really, really great point. Jumping to editing, as you were saying,
Well, you
so
mentioned another question before that, and I feel like I didn't actually answer it. And like,
no, I think you did.
perhaps, but like the choreography of working with wild animals and the
Okay.
unpredictability of it, I feel like I actually really enjoy working with bears more than people, because there's a lot less drama actually, even though they're, these really dangerous predators, I guess, but there is a predictability about them, and there's a choreography that you need to do. Not every bear is the same. So we cast bears. We do casting, and we go out and we look for particular bears that are not too curious and not too fearful, and
Oh.
somewhere in the middle, a bear that we feel like we're not going to interfere with it. It's not going to get habituated by our presence.
Mhm.
Um, and we follow it for as long as you can. And when you're on a truck, it's you basically limited to the road, so you lose them. But there's a ballet that you do, and not every
That's
animal is the same.
that is so interesting. I had no idea you were casting wild animals based on kind of their
They have
personality.
personality. Yeah, exactly. They have personalities, and that's a big part of the feature film that we're working on, is like really
Right.
developing those personalities more
Oh,
deeply.
that's so exciting. Not that we want to encourage any students, disclaimer, do not go chasing bears and coyotes. Um,
Yes, please have a local guide or an expert and do your research and adhere to all of the laws and regulations around working with wildlife. Of course, that's what we're
and
doing.
there are many of
Um,
them in Canada,
and
thank
there
goodness.
are.
Yeah. So, I mean, but we've also had films submitted on butterflies, on salmon hatching.
Mhm.
So what's it must be extremely difficult to work with the larger animals and to kind of follow them or cast them. Do you ever get scared? How does it work? How do you, what advice do you have to give about safety?
Yeah, that's a great question. What do I have to? I mean, the safety first, and always. I think that the benefit of using this mobile car rig is that we never needed to exit the vehicle.
Right.
Sometimes to change batteries and media. So there were some, moments where we had to think, okay, is this the right time to change our battery because of how close we were to a bear? But mostly we were like 99% of the time we're inside the car. And so it was really quite safe, and we're using long lenses, so we don't have to be that. We actually can be behind the tourist generally, and that was the vantage we wanted. We want the tourist in the foreground. um and so yeah, I mean, I think that working with the bears in a safe manner is like the priority for us, and we just don't want to habituate them in any way. And then the second part of your question.
Um, I think you answered it. I think you
Okay,
answered
cool.
it. Now, I know that wildlife filmmaking is also notorious for recording hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage. So
Yeah.
these films, as part of the Ecofilm Lab, are limited to a 4 minute, around 4 minute maximum. What advice do you have for cutting all of those hours of footage, working with animals? down to a short film?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, a function that some of these cameras use is called a pre-record. So your camera can actually be recording when you haven't pressed record, and it
Hmm.
will sort of save the last 30 seconds. And so if you something great happens, but you missed it because you weren't pressing record, this function kind of saves you. So you press record, it'll include the last 30 seconds, and then you don't have to have quite so much like just endless, footage.
Right.
But, it depends on. I'm not a wildlife filmmaker actually, and I don't exactly want to be one either. It's more of like my interest in filmmaking generally applied to this particular story.
Got
So
it.
I think that's the perspective that I think I'll probably speak from. And some directors shoot very little. They only want what's in the edit. It's kind of a beautiful like surgical approach. I can't do that yet. I overshoot a lot. So we had probably 36 hours or so for a 13-minute film.
Wow.
So that ratio is quite high. And I think, it'll, for other films, I would imagine it's similar wildlife stuff. There's just going to be endless footage just
Right.
because, you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's true. So in the editing room, then, is it yourself and the whole team, or that helps to pare that down? How does it get pared down to 13 minutes?
Sure, yeah, for this particular short, I mean, it was a no budget movie. We paid for everything ourselves. It was just using our own equipment. It was edited on a laptop, and so the process largely looked like me on the laptop, and then at a certain point, my producing partner and editing partner, Will Miller, and I started to pass the project back and forth and really get it from, like, an assembly to then a rough cut and then to a fine cut, and those are sort of the major stages in an edit. But it was a lot of myself and then Will, and then we would get lots of notes too. Like Gabby was, of course, always giving feedback on each sort of changes that we were making, and working really closely with the sound designer in particular, who we got involved kind of in midway through, I guess, and he really took the film to another level. I think his work. He's a really accomplished sound designer, much more experienced than we are as directors and cinematographers. So his I don't know, skill really allowed the film to speak in a way that I don't think we would have been able to do ourselves. And he basically volunteered to do the work. He wasn't even really paid, and so it was just a passion project for all of us.
Mhm. Um, Speaking of the team, I mean, when we screened Nuisance Bear Planet of Focus, I was lucky enough to meet a few of the crew. So, in the case of the Eco Film Labs, they're typically student groups. And so, in your opinion, what roles are absolutely crucial for a short film, for, in this case, a wildlife film? How big was your team, and what would you say you absolutely need? Is it
Hmm.
cinematographer, producer? Let's go into detail about the team
Sure.
itself.
Yeah, I mean, every project is very different. So you can be working with a really small team, a single person even, sometimes that's best for intimacy or just being able to move really quickly. Usually it's around 3 or 4 people. It's just kind of a standard documentary crew that's like a director, a cinematographer, maybe a field producer, sound location, if you're lucky, a camera assistant, or two. So maybe 3 to 5 people. For Nuisance Bear, it was a team of three in the field at all times. So I was driving the car, and Gabby and Sam were pulling focus and orienting the camera. They kind of go back and forth, and together we sort of framed the image. And that was it for the field. We didn't record any sound, like I mentioned before. I was doing the producing, which there frankly wasn't very much of.
Right.
And then in terms of editing, it was just 2 or 3 of us editing, myself, Andreas, and Will, and Dave doing sound. So very no music. Zach did color, of course. He did a great job. But very small crew overall through all the stages of production, shooting
Mhm.
and editing.
Yeah, it's wild and so impressive. Let's talk about the sound. You've mentioned it a few times, and something that's often, audio is incredibly important, of course, and it's often overlooked, especially for the short student films.
Mm.
It doesn't. needing audio and needing quality audio doesn't mean you have to fill the void with music or interviews like you see a lot in a traditional documentary. So can you, in fact, Deuce and Spare has none of that. So can you talk about the choice that you guys made to keep
Mhm.
the film almost entirely dialogue and music free?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's something that I think we're most proud of, and it's one of the major creative limitations that we placed upon ourselves. And I think the lack of music was something we had agreed on pretty early. I think even when before we were shooting, we were like aware of this overuse of full orchestra for wildlife films in particular.
Right.
And so we wanted to see like, well, do people still care if you're not being emotionally sort of suggested by the music, you know? And then because of COVID and the interviews that we got just being kind of bad, they were like not very interesting, or the people we were interviewing, like they had talking points. They were like politicians or scientists, and they were comfortable being on camera, so they knew what to say. That's not that interesting to me as a filmmaker or as an audience member. And so we ended up just doing, a pass of this assembly, putting the sound design in, it kind of came alive. And then we were like, wouldn't it be crazy if we just like, that's it, this is the movie? I mean, that's something I would want to see. And so we just kind of went for it. And it was very much an experiment. I hadn't seen that done before. Maybe, yeah, similar stuff, but not even those films that I'd seen as a reference had like some kind of tonal, sound design, like even just like a strings or something kind of dissonant or whatever. This ours basically, it has no music or any kind of instrumentation whatsoever.
Mhm. And it was also incredibly powerful that you don't even really see humans until this trick or treat scene.
Yeah,
You know that there are polar bears roaming around the town, and yet all the kids are out and they're trick
yeah,
or treating, and so you're on edge the entire time because that's really the only time you see human bodies until I guess the end when the polar bear is captured, right? Or no, there's
yeah.
tourists too. So there's
There's
these,
some people
yeah.
sprinkled throughout.
Anytime you
Yeah.
see people, it's like this tense moment. So it's yeah, a really exciting choice that you guys made. And so was the sound recorded on like while you were there, or was that designed afterward? The sound that
Uh, Yeah, that's a question I wish we got more, honestly. I think a lot of people think we've recorded the sound on location because it's meant to sound that way, but it's
Mhm.
completely fake. All of it is Foley. It's
Wow.
all sound effects. Just I have a music background, and so I think I have a quite a good attention to detail, especially audio detail. And maybe I'm just imagining that I remember what things sounded like, but when I was editing, I could imagine what those moments sounded like. And so then I just sort of went from there. And I'm really happy that a lot of the sound effects and choices that I made in the early sound design are the choices that Dave sort of stuck with and just enhanced and made a lot better. And so we really worked together, and that was a really fun collaboration.
That's so exciting. My background is audio too and music, so it's something that I definitely noticed. It felt as you were there, but enhanced, exactly as you said.
Cool.
So I thought that was, yeah, completely intentional from the beginning, and I loved it. It's so
Thank
dynamic.
you.
Um, so the whole goal of the Eco Film Lab is, of course, to encourage students to get out in their communities, to create change, to show their world from their perspective, and through that, our goal, hopefully, is to inspire some young filmmakers. So there might be some students involved who want to continue pursuing filmmaking. What advice would you give them?
Reach out to people on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. Like with the strike right now, a lot of people aren't doing anything. And this is sort of a continuation of COVID in a way where when film production isn't happening, people who do those roles are sitting around, and they'd be happy to talk to you. I mean, if you want to send me a message, please go ahead. I'm happy to answer any questions. And so I think just engaging with people, asking lots of questions, finding the types of films that you really like and trying to understand why.
Mhm.
I think those are really helpful exercises too. But yeah, I think like for me, life and filmmaking is like just a journey of curiosity and kind of constantly asking questions and learning. And I just find it so exciting. So, um, Yeah, I would say like it's not a passive process. It's like something you sort of have to really actively want to be involved with, and so that can kind of be scary sometimes, like, putting yourself out there, but it gets easier and it's really worth it. And so I think like building a community and just reaching out to people that you want to learn from is a really great way to start.
I totally agree. I'm a big believer in you don't know if you don't try, you don't know if you don't ask. So I love that advice. I think that applies to anything in life, but
It
especially
does.
to being an artist for sure. And the arts community is quite supportive, aren't we lucky?
We are so lucky, and again, it only seems scary before you ask, and what's the worst thing? They might not answer, or they might say no, that's
Yeah,
okay.
that's okay.
It's not personal at all,
No,
they're somebody's busy, you just ask the next person, and a lot of the friends around me and the people that I look up to have that tenacity where they just keep advocating for self, asking questions and just, pursuing their dreams, they just keep going.
I think that's fantastic advice. Thank you so much, Jack.
Yeah, no problem.
We will definitely share your handle. I'm going to put some clips of Nuisance Bear into this segment, and yeah, I want to thank you again, and hope that all you students at home have learned quite a bit from the wonderful Jack Wiseman, and take a great look and screen Nuisance Bear at home. Take care, everyone.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.